Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive
Well,
into something that sounds super complicated, but is actually pretty relatable once you get the hang of it.
yeah,
Condorcet's Paradox.
right.
You might have heard about it before.
Uh-huh.
It's the idea that even if everyone's individual preferences make perfect sense,
Yeah.
majority voting can still lead to some really weird, loopy outcomes.
Yeah.
But today, we're not just skimming the surface.
Right.
We're going deep,
We are.
thanks to a whole stack of sources.
Awesome.
You've got academic papers that take us all the way back to Condorcet himself in the 18th century.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a deep dive.
Yeah.
Right up to some cutting-edge analysis from 2017 that uses things like SAT solvers and belief functions.
Cool.
We'll even touch on a 2013 book chapter that throws some serious shade, questioning how often this paradox actually shows up in the real world. Our mission, to really understand this paradox from every angle.
Okay.
We'll define it clearly,
Yeah.
figure out how likely it is to happen,
Oh.
and even explore some potential escape routes.
Right.
So get ready,
Okay.
because things are about to get paradoxically interesting.
What's fascinating about Condorcet's paradox is that it reveals a fundamental tension between individual rationality and collective choice.
Okay.
Let's start with the classic definition to really understand what we're dealing with.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
Hit me with the key points.
At its core, the paradox highlights that while individuals might have preferences that are perfectly logical, meaning if you prefer A to B and B to C, you also prefer A to C,
Right.
group preferences determined by majority voting can become cyclical.
Interesting.
This means the group might prefer A to B, B to C,
Okay.
but then C to A.
Whoa, that's like a preference pretzel.
Yeah,
So it's not just that the group picks something suboptimal.
right.
It's that the group's choice as a whole contradicts itself.
Exactly.
Okay.
Imagine a group of friends trying to pick a movie.
Okay.
One friend might prefer action to comedy and comedy to romance.
Okay.
Another might prefer comedy to romance and romance to action.
Got it.
And the third might prefer romance to action and action to comedy.
Right.
If you vote on each pairing,
Yeah.
you could end up with the group preferring action over comedy,
Okay.
comedy over romance,
Yeah.
and romance over action. A complete loop.
So even though each individual has their preferences in a neat line,
Yeah,
when you combine them, it becomes a circle.
exactly.
I'm starting to see how this could mess things up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And this paradox has been a thorn in the side of voting theorists for centuries.
Well, speaking of centuries, let's rewind a bit.
Okay.
Condorcet himself was actually trying to figure out how likely his paradox was way back in the 1785. That's some serious dedication.
Yeah, it is.
His work was incredibly insightful for its time,
He was.
but later researchers, especially in a 2002 paper, pointed out that his calculations were based on some pretty simplified assumptions. I'm sensing some academic drama.
Oh.
What were these simplifying assumptions?
Condorcet assumed this perfect balance in social outcomes, meaning each option in a pairwise vote was equally likely to win.
Right.
He also kind of ignored the idea that some patterns of preferences are more common than others in the real world.
Okay.
Something called voter coherence.
So it's like he was assuming everyone was picking their preferences at random.
Yes,
That doesn't seem very realistic.
exactly.
Okay.
That's where later researchers came in with more nuanced models for how preferences might be distributed.
Right.
They came up with things like impartial anonymous culture, IAC,
Okay.
where every possible order of preferences is equally likely.
Okay, so IAC is basically saying everyone's preferences are like a random lottery. Interesting.
Yeah.
What other models did they come up with?
There are others, like
Okay.
maximal culture, Emstemesli, where all logically possible combinations of individual preferences are equally likely, and impartial culture, IC, which assumes all possible preference profiles are equally likely.
Got it.
Each has its own quirks,
Right.
and they lead to different probabilities for the paradox occurring.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
We're already talking about the probability of this paradox happening. I thought we were still just defining it.
Well, the definition and the probability are deeply intertwined.
I see.
To fully grasp Condorcet's paradox, we need to understand not just what it is,
Right.
but also how likely it is to actually throw a wrench in our decision-making processes.
All right, you've convinced me.
Okay.
So how did these different models change the way we think about the paradox's likelihood?
Okay.
Give me the highlights.
What's really interesting is that even with these different models,
Yeah.
we start to see some consistent patterns.
Okay.
One of the most counterintuitive is that the paradox is actually more likely to happen with fewer voters.
Yeah.
That's wild. You'd think the more people you have voting, the more likely you are to smooth out any weirdness.
It seems that way, right?
Yeah.
But the math actually shows otherwise.
Interesting.
And for really large groups, the paradox becomes quite rare.
Okay.
This directly contradicts Condorcet's own findings.
Okay. This is blowing my mind a little bit.
Yeah.
So we've got the classic definition of the paradox.
Right.
And we're starting to see how its likelihood depends on how we think about people's preferences.
Exactly.
I feel like we're building a solid foundation here.
We are.
Okay.
And this foundation is essential as we move on to explore the paradox's broader implications.
Perfect timing.
Right.
Let's shift gears and talk about how this paradox pops up beyond just simple voting scenarios.
Okay.
Especially in those 2017 papers.
Right.
Because let's be real,
Yeah.
life is rarely as simple as choosing between three options.
Absolutely.
One area where the paradox makes a surprise appearance is in the world of preference fusion.
Where the goal is to combine diverse opinions or data into a single coherent order. So like if we were trying to rank everyone's favorite ice cream flavors
Right.
based on their individual preferences,
Exactly.
it's here that we encounter the concept of belief functions,
Okay.
which are essentially a way to represent preferences that aren't absolute. Okay, belief functions sound intriguing,
Yeah.
but also a bit complex.
A little bit.
Can you break them down for us?
Think of them as a way to quantify how much we believe in a particular preference.
Okay.
Instead of just saying, I prefer chocolate to vanilla, a belief function might say, I believe chocolate is preferred to vanilla with 80% certainty.
So it's like a measure of confidence in our preferences.
Exactly.
That makes sense because sometimes we're not 100% sure what we want,
Right.
or we might have multiple preferences that are kind of in conflict.
Exactly.
And when you apply belief functions to group decision-making,
Uh-huh.
it gets really interesting because now we're dealing with a whole spectrum of certainty.
Right.
Rather than just simple yes or no votes.
Yeah.
I see how that would add a whole new layer of complexity.
It does.
So how does that 2017 research connect belief functions to the Condorcet paradox?
Well, that paper proposes two different strategies for combining these uncertain preferences,
Okay.
which they call strategy A and strategy B.
Two strategies.
Okay.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Strategy A takes all of an individual's beliefs about a specific pair of options and combines them into a single belief function.
Okay.
Then it combines those functions across all individuals.
Right.
Strategy B flips that order.
Interesting.
First, combining belief functions for each preference across all individuals, and then combining those results into a final belief function for each pair of options.
So strategy A is like looking at each person's beliefs as a whole,
Right.
while strategy B is more about looking at each preference across the whole group.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that these two strategies have different implications for how well they scale. As the number of people involved increases.
Scalability,
Yeah.
the eternal struggle.
Right.
So which strategy wins out in that department?
It turns out strategy B is more robust in handling a large number of information sources.
Okay.
As you add more people to the mix.
Yeah.
Strategy A is more likely to break down and produce results that just don't make sense.
Okay, so strategy B is more like a well-oiled machine that can handle a crowd.
Yeah.
That's good to know, especially if we're thinking about applying these concepts to real-world situations with lots of people involved.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And speaking of real-world applications,
Yeah.
let's move on to another fascinating question.
Okay.
Can we actually escape this paradox altogether?
Right. Is there a way to guarantee that our group decisions won't end up in a cyclical mess,
Wow.
even with Condorcet lurking in the shadows? Because I'm starting to get a little paranoid about how easily our choices can go haywire.
Well, the answer, as with many things in life, is it depends. The 2017 paper we keep mentioning suggests a way to visualize preferences as a directed graph.
Okay.
And this opens up some interesting possibilities.
Okay, graph theory time. I'll admit, I'm a little rusty on this.
Yeah.
How can graphs help us understand Condorcet's paradox?
Think of it like a map of connections between different preferences.
Okay.
A Condorcet cycle in graph terms looks like a loop.
Right.
You can follow a path from any point in the cycle and end up right back where you started.
So it's like those roundabouts that I can never seem to escape from?
Yeah.
Going round and round without ever reaching a clear destination?
Exactly. And just like with a roundabout, the key to escaping a Condorcet cycle is to find an exit.
Right.
To break the loop.
So we're trying to turn a cyclical mess into a clear path.
Right.
A line instead of a circle.
Precisely. We want to transform that graph into what's called a DAG.
Okay.
Or a directed acyclic graph.
Right.
Meaning a graph without any cycles. And the paper proposes 2 algorithms for achieving this.
Algorithms. Huh.
Yeah.
Lay it on me.
Welcome.
What do these algorithms actually do?
One is called a naive algorithm.
Okay.
It basically detects cycles and then removes connections to break them.
Right.
It's straightforward, but not always the most efficient.
Okay.
The other is an incremental algorithm,
Right.
which builds the graph step by step, carefully adding connections in a specific order to prevent those cycles from forming in the first place.
So one is like a demolition crew, breaking things down.
Yeah.
While the other is more like a careful architect building with cycles in mind from the start.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
And the choice of which algorithm to use really depends on the specific structure of the problem you're dealing with.
I'm starting to see how this could get really complex really fast.
It can.
But the takeaway seems to be that sometimes by cleverly rearranging how we represent preferences, we can actually avoid those dreaded cycles.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that these algorithms are just tools.
Right.
They don't magically solve the problem of Condorcet's paradox in every situation.
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all solution here.
Yeah.
But it's still encouraging to know that there are ways to potentially mitigate the paradox's impact.
Absolutely.
But you know what's been nagging me this whole time?
Oh.
We've been talking about this paradox.
Yeah.
Its probability.
Yeah.
Potential escape routes.
Right.
But we haven't really talked about how often it actually shows up in the real world.
That's a crucial point.
Okay.
And to be honest, it's the million-dollar question that researchers have been grappling with for decades.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Wait, seriously.
Yeah.
We've gone through all of this.
Yeah.
And we still don't know how often this paradox rears its ugly head in real-life decisions.
The challenge is that a lot of the research focuses on theoretical models and hypothetical scenarios, which are helpful for understanding the paradox's mechanics, but don't always reflect the complexities of real-world decision-making.
Right, like those preference models we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
IAC, MC, IC.
Yeah.
They're useful tools.
They are.
But real life is rarely that neat and tidy.
Right.
What about real-world data?
There's been some research on that front,
Yeah.
particularly in the context of elections. But as a 2013 book chapter we mentioned earlier points out, it's tough to say for sure how often Condorcet's paradox is the culprit behind a strange election outcome.
So even though we can model it and try to understand it,
Yeah.
pinning down the paradox in the wild is a whole other challenge.
Yeah, it is.
Almost like trying to catch a glimpse of Bigfoot.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
But, the pursuit itself is incredibly valuable.
Right.
By trying to understand how and why Condorcet's paradox might be influencing real-world decisions, we're forced to examine our assumptions, refine our methods, and ultimately develop a deeper understanding of how we make choices, both as individuals and as societies.
Okay. I'm feeling a little less frustrated and a little more intrigued now.
All right.
So it's less about finding a definitive answer.
Right.
And more about the journey of exploration and understanding.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
And this journey has taken us from the basic definition of Condorcet's paradox to its probability calculations and even to potential strategies for mitigating its impact.
Right.
But there's still one crucial piece of the puzzle we need to explore, the broader implications of this paradox for how we think about decision-making.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
Yeah.
Let's dive into those implications. All right, so we've spent a good chunk of time unpacking Condorcet's paradox.
Yeah.
From its basic definition to its probability and even those wild graph theory solutions.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what does this all mean for us in the grand scheme of things?
Okay.
What should we be taking away from this deep dive?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? Beyond the math and the models, what does Condorcet's paradox teach us about ourselves and how we make decisions?
Exactly. What are the big... So what's for our listeners?
Well, first and foremost, it reminds us that collective decision-making, even when it seems straightforward, like majority voting is actually really complex.
Okay.
Even when individuals are perfectly rational in their own preferences, those individual preferences can clash in surprising ways when you try to combine them into a group choice.
It's like that whole wisdom of the crowd idea goes out the window.
It definitely challenges that assumption.
Right.
It shows us that just because something wins a vote, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best or most preferred choice overall.
So it's not just about picking a winner.
Right.
It's about the potential for the process itself to go haywire.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this has huge implications for everything, from political elections to decisions made within companies, and even just deciding where to go for dinner with friends.
But if we can't rely on simple majority voting, what are we supposed to do?
Right.
Are we doomed to constantly make choices that contradict themselves?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
While there's no one-size-fits-all solution,
Right.
Condorcet's Paradox encourages us to be more mindful of how we structure our decision-making process.
Okay, so instead of blindly trusting the majority vote, what can we do to make better group decisions?
One important step is to be aware of the potential for cyclical preferences and to consider alternative voting systems.
Right.
Some systems are specifically designed to minimize the likelihood of Condorcet's paradox.
So it's about being more strategic and thoughtful about how we set up the voting itself.
Yes.
Not just assuming majority rules is always the best way to go.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we can also learn a lot from those graph theory solutions we discussed earlier sometime.
Yeah.
Just by reframing the way we visualize preferences, we can untangle those cyclical knots and arrive at a more coherent outcome.
So even though the paradox shows us that group decisions can be messy and unpredictable, it also encourages us to find creative solutions.
Absolutely. And beyond the practical implications, I think Condorcet's Paradox offers a valuable lesson in humility.
Interesting.
It reminds us that even with the best intentions and perfectly logical individuals, collective decision-making is inherently complex, and there will always be the potential for unexpected outcomes.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of the limitations of our systems, but also embrace the challenge of finding better ways to make choices together.
Exactly.
Right.
And while the research into the paradox's real-world frequency continues, the very act of grappling with these questions deepens our understanding of how we function as a society.
This has been a fascinating and slightly unsettling
A little bit.
We've learned that Condorcet's paradox is more than just a mathematical curiosity.
Definitely.
It's a powerful reminder that collective decision-making is a delicate dance between individual rationality and the potential for collective chaos.
Well said.
Okay.
It encourages us to question our assumptions, explore alternative approaches, and approach group decisions with a healthy dose of skepticism and a dash of creativity.
So to wrap things up, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to ponder as they head back into the world of choices big and small?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. The next time you're faced with a group decision, whether it's voting in an election or choosing a movie with your family, take a moment to reflect on the potential for Condorcet's paradox to be lurking in the shadows. Don't just assume that the majority vote is the right choice. Consider the individual preferences, the possible cycles, and the various factors that might be influencing the outcome.
It's like that saying, forewarned is forearmed.
Exactly.
By being aware of the paradox, we can be more mindful of how we make choices, both as individuals and as part of a group.
Absolutely.
Right.
And if you're feeling extra adventurous, maybe even suggest trying out a different voting system the next time you're stuck in a decision-making deadlock.
Now, that's a challenge I think our listeners are up for.
I think so, too.
Well, everyone, that brings our deep dive into Condorcet's Paradox to a close.
Great.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the basic definition to the complexities of preference aggregation and the search for solutions. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to all the research we discussed. And if you have any thoughts or insights on Condorcet's Paradox, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes.
You can find us on social media or leave a comment on our website.
Awesome.
Until next time.
All right.
Keep those minds curious and those well, maybe not always majority rules.